The galaxy smells of ozone, cheap synthale, and desperation. For a man like Captain Elias Vance, it was the only perfume he'd known for 20 years. He was a hauler, a nobody, captain of a rust bucket freighter with more empty seats in its mess hall than credits in his account. He needed a crewman, anyone, to fill a seat and run a diagnostic. What he found was something else, entirely. A refugee, a giant of a creature with eyes that held the ghosts of a fallen world, who offered not strength, not skill with a blaster, but a simple, whispered promise that would change everything. The air in the docking bay of Port Caladan was a thick cocktail of recycled oxygen, spilled machine lubricant, and the faint, acrid tang of alien sweat. Captain Elias Vance leaned against the pitted hull of his ship, the Vagrant, and took a long drag from his stim stick. The faint blue smoke curled into the chaotic miasma. He was a man carved from galactic driftwood, all hard lines and weary angles, with a salt and pepper beard that couldn't decide whether to surrender to grey. He needed a systems tech, or a loader, or a co-pilot. Hell, at this point, he'd settle for a janitor with a steady pulse. His last crewman, a twitchy human named Rex, had gambled away his next 3 paychecks, and then himself in a high-stakes card game with some 4-armed grown traders. Vance was left with a cargo of medicinal hydroponics, bound for the Kepler 186F colony, a tight deadline, and an empty chair on the bridge. Port Caladan was the last stop for the desperate, a floating junkyard of a station where fortunes were lost and lives were cheap. He'd spent 2 rotations interviewing candidates, a washed-out Alliance pilot who demanded a full partnership, a cybernetically enhanced youth who tried to hack Vance's personal datapad during the interview, a series of grifters, addicts, and fools. He was about to give up, to risk the run solo, and pray the automated systems didn't have a catastrophic failure in the middle of the Serpent's nebula, when he saw him. The alien was Cathar. Vance recognized the species instantly. They were giants, easily 7 feet tall, with a body structure that was a powerful mix of corded muscle and thick, chitinous plating around the joints and shoulders. Their skin was the color of slate, and their faces were long and vaguely equine, with large, expressive, deep-set eyes. This one, however, was a pathetic sight. His plating was dull and scratched, his posture stooped not in deference, but in defeat. He was huddled near a stack of discarded power converters, trying to make himself small, an impossible task for a creature of his size. He was clearly a refugee, one of the countless Cathar displaced after the Xylan Dominion had glassed their home world and subjugated their people. Vance watched as a pair of station security guards, their uniforms stretched tight over synth muscle enhancements, shoved the Cathar. The giant stumbled, but didn't retaliate. He just absorbed the abuse, his large, dark eyes fixed on the grimy deck plates. Something in Vance, a deeply buried ember of decency he thought had long gone cold, stirred. He flicked his stim stick into a disposal unit and walked over. "That's enough," Vance said, his voice a low baritone rumble. The guards turned, their expressions shifting from casual cruelty to annoyance. "Mind your own business, freighter trash. This one's loitering. No papers, no purpose." "He's with me," Vance lied, surprising himself. The guards shared a look. The taller one sneered. "This broken-down Xylan pet? What for? You need a living ballast?" Vance didn't rise to the bait. He held the guard's gaze, his eyes as cold and grey as a dead star. He wasn't a fighter anymore, but he still had the look of a man who knew how to end a fight. After a tense moment, the guards shrugged and moved on, looking for easier targets. Vance turned to the Cathar, who was now staring at him with an unreadable expression. "Are you looking for work?" The giant flinched slightly at the direct question. His voice, when it came, was a soft, hesitant bass, like rocks tumbling deep underground. It was jarring, coming from such a formidable frame. I have no marketable skills, sir. I cannot pilot. I am not trained in engineering or weaponry. So what can you do? Vance asked, his patience already wearing thin. This was a mistake. He should have just stayed on his ship. Cathar looked down at his own massive, scarred hands. They were hands made for crushing rock or building monuments. For a long moment, the silence stretched, filled only by the station's hum. Vance was about to turn and leave, to write this off as another dead end. Then the alien looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. There was a flicker of something in their depths. Not hope, but a desperate final plea. I don't talk much, sir, but I can cook. Vance stared. Of all the things he expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. The vagrant's galley was a disaster. The nutrient paste dispenser produced 3 flavors: grey, off-grey, and vaguely green-grey. Real food was a luxury he hadn't been able to afford in years. He thought about the long, lonely nights ahead, staring at a plate of synthetic sludge. He looked at the hulking, broken creature before him. A cook. It was absurd. It was illogical. It was the only offer he'd had all day that didn't involve him getting cheated or stabbed. A slow smile, the first in a long time, cracked the weary landscape of Elias Vance's face. Good enough for me, the human said. Name's Vance, captain of that ship. He jerked a thumb towards the vagrant. What do I call you? My designation was Unit 734, Cathar said softly. My name is Alan. All right, Alan, Vance said, clapping him on his broad, slate-grey shoulder. The muscle beneath was as hard as iron. Welcome aboard the Vagrant. Let's go see about this cooking. Life aboard the Vagrant was a monotonous rhythm of humming engines, blinking console lights, and the profound, soul-crushing silence of deep space. For the first 2 days after leaving Port Caladan, Alan was a ghost. A 7-foot-tall, 300-pound ghost who moved with an unnerving quietness through the ship's narrow corridors. He performed the simple maintenance tasks Vance assigned him, cleaning filters, running low-level diagnostics, securing cargo, with a silent, focused efficiency. He never spoke unless spoken to, and his answers were always clipped and direct. Vance was beginning to think he'd made a strange but ultimately harmless mistake. He'd hired a janitor, not a cook. The nutrient paste dispenser continued to churn out its daily ration of grey sludge, and Alan ate it without complaint. On the 3rd day, everything changed. Vance was on the bridge, running a tedious sensor sweep of a nearby asteroid cluster, when a smell hit him. It wasn't the usual sterile scent of the ship's life support. This was something real. Something impossible. It was the warm, savory aroma of roasted protein, the sharp, inviting scent of herbs, and a complex, underlying sweetness that he couldn't place. His stomach rumbled, a sound he hadn't heard in years. He followed the scent to the galley, a small, utilitarian room he usually avoided. The space had been transformed. Alan had scrubbed every surface until the dull metal gleamed. The ship's meager hydroponics bay, which Vance used to grow a few hardy, tasteless nutrient grasses, had been meticulously tended. But the focus of the room was the small thermal cooker, from which the incredible aroma was emanating. Alan stood by the counter, his massive form bent in concentration as he arranged something on a plate. He turned as Vance entered, a flicker of apprehension in his dark eyes. "I apologize, Captain," Alan rumbled. "I activated the galley systems without permission. I used some of the emergency ration packs." Vance barely heard him. His eyes were locked on the plate Alan held. It wasn't a nutrient paste. It was a thick, perfectly seared protein patty, drizzled with a dark, glistening sauce, and served alongside a mound of vibrant green shoots and what looked like some kind of roasted root vegetable. "The protein is reconstituted from the ration packs," Aylin explained softly, as if sensing Vance's disbelief. "The greens are from the hydroponics bay. The root is a type of tuber I found in the stores. It is still viable. The sauce is a reduction made from the nutrient broth and some sterilized fungal cultures I encouraged in a dark corner of the bay." Vance was speechless. He took the plate. The food was warm in his hands. He sat down at the small table, feeling strangely formal. He picked up the fork, an instrument that had only ever been used to stir sludge, and took a bite. The explosion of flavor was so intense, so unexpected, that it sent a jolt through his entire body. The protein was rich and juicy, the sauce a perfect balance of savory, sweet, and tangy. The greens were crisp and peppery, and the tuber was earthy and satisfying. It wasn't just food, it was a symphony. But it was more than that. As he ate, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear as a photograph. He was a boy again, on his grandfather's farm on a terraformed moon in the Sirius system. It was a hot summer afternoon, and his grandfather, a man with a booming laugh and hands like worn leather, was pulling fire-roasted tubers from a pit in the ground. The smell, the taste of the slightly charred, earthy flesh. It was here, on this plate, light years and a lifetime away. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. He quickly blinked them away, clearing his throat. "It's good," he managed to say, his voice thick. Aylin simply nodded, a silent observer. From that day on, the galley became the heart of the ship. Every meal was a revelation. Aylin could take the most basic, uninspired ingredients, rehydrated protein, dried legumes, nutrient powders, and transform them into culinary masterpieces. He made a stew from dried beans and ship-grown fungi that tasted of slow-cooked meat and winter fires. He created a crisp, bread-like substance from processed grain flour that Vance hadn't even known they had. Vance found himself looking forward to meal times with an almost boyish excitement. The food did more than just fill his stomach. It seemed to fill the hollow, lonely spaces inside him. He started talking more during their meals, telling old stories of his time in the Alliance Navy, of ports he'd visited, of ships he'd flown. Aylin remained quiet, but he listened. Vance could feel Cathar's attention, a steady, calming presence. And Vance noticed something else, something strange. On days when he was feeling the ache of an old shrapnel wound in his leg, the food would have a subtle, anti-inflammatory quality. On days when the crushing loneliness of command was particularly heavy, the meal would be rich and comforting, like a shield against the void. He dismissed it as his imagination, as the simple, psychological effect of eating good food after years of deprivation. One evening, about a month into their journey, Vance was looking over their cargo manifest. They were running low on some of the hydroponic catalyzers. He called Aylin to the bridge. "We need to make a stop at a trade outpost in the Zephyr Expanse to resupply," Vance said, pointing at a star chart on the main screen. "It's a bit off our course, but we need the supplies." Aylin stood behind him, staring at the screen. For the first time, Vance saw a genuine emotion cross his face. Fear. His massive frame seemed to shrink, and the slate grey of his skin took on a paler, ashen hue. "Captain," Aylin said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Zephyr Expanse is heavily patrolled." "Patrolled by who? The corporate patrols are a joke. We can handle them." "Not them," Aylin said, his dark eyes wide with an ancient terror. "It is a sphere of influence for the Xylan Dominion. We cannot go there." Before Vance could ask why, a blaring alarm filled the bridge, a proximity alert. A ship had just dropped out of hyperspace right off their port bow. It was sleek, predatory, and gunmetal black, shaped like a vicious raptor's talon. The insignia on its hull made Vance's blood run cold. It was a Xylan Enforcer-class vessel. A tinny, synthesized voice crackled over the comms, dripping with arrogance and authority. "Unidentified freighter, this is the harbinger of the Xylan Dominion. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. We are searching for stolen property." Vance looked from the menacing warship on the screen to the terrified giant standing beside him. The stolen property wasn't the hydroponics in his cargo hold. It was his cook. The air on the bridge of the Vagrant became thick and heavy, charged with the silent hum of the Xylan ship's active targeting sensors. Elias Vance's mind raced. An Enforcer-class ship wasn't a patrol cutter. It was a wolf pack leader, armed to the teeth and crewed by the most zealous soldiers of the Dominion. Running was suicide. Fighting was a joke. "Captain Vance," the Xylan voice crackled again, impatient. "Your compliance is not optional. Power down, now." "Complying," Vance said into the comm, his voice a flat, steady line he did not feel. He keyed in the sequence, and the familiar thrum of the Vagrant's engines died down, leaving an unnerving silence. He turned to Aelin. The Cathar was trembling, a subtle, deep tremor that shook his entire 7-foot frame. His face was a mask of pure terror. "Aelin, what is this?" Vance demanded, his voice low and urgent. "Why are they looking for you?" "I was—" "Property," Aelin whispered, his gaze fixed on the menacing shape on the view screen. "Of Warlord Valerius." Vance felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's life support. Warlord Valerius wasn't just any Xylan. He was a name spoken in hushed tones in the darkest corners of the galaxy. A brilliant, ruthless strategist responsible for the subjugation of a dozen systems, including Cathar. He was infamous for his cruelty and his particular tastes. "What did you do?" Vance pressed. "I served in his personal retinue, in his kitchens. I fled." "You were his cook?" Vance asked, incredulous. "They send an Enforcer-class warship for a runaway cook?" A proximity alert chimed as a smaller vessel detached from the Harbinger and began its approach. A boarding shuttle. They had minutes at most. "Aelin, look at me," Vance commanded. Cathar tore his eyes from the screen and looked at his captain. "There is a smuggler's compartment beneath the aft cargo bay. It's shielded. It's where Rex used to hide his contraband. Get in it. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear." Aelin hesitated. "They will tear the ship apart, Captain. They will find me. They will punish you for harboring me." "That's my problem," Vance said, his jaw set. "You are a member of my crew. I won't give up on my crew. Now go." For a fleeting second, Aelin's terrified expression was replaced by one of profound disbelief. He gave Vance a short, sharp nod, a gesture of respect from a species that had been given no reason to respect anyone, and disappeared from the bridge, his heavy footsteps once making a sound as he rushed down the corridor. Vance took a deep breath, smoothed down his jacket, and prepared to be boarded. The docking clamps shuddered against the hull with a jarring clang. Moments later, the airlock hissed open, followed by the heavy, rhythmic tramp of magnetic boots on the deck plating. 5 figures entered the bridge. 4 were Xylan shock troopers, encased in black and crimson armor, their helmets concealing their reptilian features. They held pulse rifles at the ready, their movements precise and menacing. The figure in the lead, however, was different. He wore no helmet. He was tall for a Xylan, with scales the color of polished obsidian and eyes like chips of yellow ice. A thin, cruel slash of a mouth twisted into a condescending smirk as he surveyed the cramped, worn-out bridge of the Vagrant. This was Commander Kyle, Valerius's right hand. "Captain Elias Vance," Kyle hissed, his voice like grinding metal. He consulted a datapad. Formerly of the Terran Alliance Navy, dishonorably discharged, now a freelance cargo hauler, a sad little trajectory. "My career choices aren't your concern, Commander," Vance said calmly, leaning back in his chair. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this interruption? My cargo is legal and my flight plan is filed." Kyle's smirk widened. "We are not here for your cargo. We are searching for a fugitive, a Cathar slave, designated Unit 734. Our intelligence places it in this sector. It is the property of the glorious warlord Valerius himself." "A Cathar." Vance feigned surprise, then chuckled. "Commander, look at this ship. It's just me. I can't afford a crew, let alone a slave, especially not one of those big, clumsy brutes. They eat too much." Kyle's yellow eyes narrowed, scanning every corner of the bridge. "Our sensors detected 2 distinct life signs aboard this vessel moments before we hailed you. One human, one other. Non-human. Large." Vance's heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of bored indifference. "My apologies. You must have detected the ship's maintenance drone. It's an old model, has a biosignature scrambler that sometimes glitches. I was just running its monthly cleanup cycle in the engine room. I've powered it down now. You know how these old rust buckets are." It was a weak lie, a desperate gamble. Kyle was not a fool. The commander stepped forward, his boots clicking menacingly on the deck. He leaned in close to Vance, his cold, reptilian breath washing over the human's face. "Warlord Valerius is a collector of rare and valuable things, Captain. This particular Cathar is unique, irreplaceable. The warlord is very displeased by its absence. I would hate to think you are obstructing his will." He straightened up and nodded to his troopers. "Search the ship, every compartment. If you find so much as a single grey hair that doesn't belong to this human, bring it to me." The troopers moved out, their efficiency terrifying. Vance sat in his chair, a cold sweat trickling down his spine, listening to the sounds of his ship being systematically violated. He heard them opening panels, scanning bulkheads, and tossing aside crates in the cargo hold. He could only pray the shielding on the smuggler's compartment was as good as the dealer who sold it to him had claimed. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Kyle stood motionless on the bridge, his yellow eyes fixed on Vance, waiting. Finally, the lead trooper returned. "Commander," the soldier reported. "The ship is clean. Scans show no anomalies. No hidden compartments detected. The only non-human life sign is a colony of nutrient fungus in the hydroponics bay." Vance allowed himself a small, internal sigh of relief. Kyle's expression soured. He turned his cold gaze back to Vance, a flicker of doubt and frustration in his eyes. "It seems our intelligence was flawed," Kyle hissed, clearly displeased. "A pity. Warlord Valerius offers a substantial reward for his property." "I'll keep an eye out," Vance said dryly. Kyle stared at him for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod. "We are done here." The Xylans marched off the bridge, their magnetic boots echoing down the corridor. Vance waited until he heard the airlock cycle and felt the gentle shudder as their boarding shuttle detached. On the view screen, the shuttle returned to the Harbinger, which, after a moment, shimmered and vanished back into hyperspace. Silence returned to the ship. Vance sagged in his chair, the adrenaline leaving him shaky and exhausted. He had faced down pirates, corporate thugs, and alliance court-martials, but nothing had terrified him like the cold, obsessive certainty in Commander Kyle's eyes. He waited a full 10 minutes before keying the ship-wide comm. "Alan, it's clear." A few minutes later, the Cathar appeared on the bridge. He looked pale, but the abject terror was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep gratitude. He stood before Vance's chair, his massive form seeming to fill the entire cockpit. "They are gone? For now," Vance said, rubbing his tired eyes. He looked up at the giant he had risked everything for. "Aylin, we need to talk. You need to tell me exactly why a Xylan warlord would send a warship to find his personal cook." Aylin looked down at his hands, then back at Vance. The time for secrets was over. "Because, Captain," Aylin said, his voice heavy with the weight of his past. "I was not just his cook. The Xylans do not understand food. They understand only fuel. I did something else for him. Something only my people can do." He paused, gathering his courage. "My cooking. It is not just about taste, Captain. I can sense the needs of a person, their biology, their deficiencies, even their emotions. I create food that doesn't just nourish, it changes them. For Warlord Valerius, I made him stronger, faster, more focused. I cleansed his body of toxins and sharpened his mind for battle. I was his most valuable weapon." Vance stared at him, the strange effects of Aylin's food suddenly making a terrifying kind of sense. The ache in his leg vanishing, the comfort on lonely nights. It wasn't his imagination. "And," Aylin continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "he fears what I can do to his enemies, or what I could do to him." The revelation hung in the recycled air of the bridge like a radioactive cloud. Vance leaned forward, his elbows on the console, trying to process the sheer magnitude of what Aylin had just confessed. It was one thing to be a good cook. It was another thing entirely to be a biochemist of such intuitive, preternatural skill that your food could be considered a weapon. "Explain," Vance said, his voice quiet but firm. "Start from the beginning. What is this ability?" Aylin took what seemed like a steadying breath, a slow intake of air that expanded his massive chest. "It is not something we learn, Captain. It is something we are. The Cathar evolved on a world with a complex and often hostile biosphere. To survive, we developed a symbiotic sensitivity to the biochemistry around us. We can taste the wind and know what plants are in bloom miles away. We can touch the soil and sense its mineral balance. And when we prepare food for another being, we can sense them too." He gestured vaguely towards Vance. "When I first met you on Port Caladan, I could sense the chronic inflammation in the tissues of your leg, a result of an old injury. I could sense the slight hormonal imbalance caused by long-term stress and reliance on nutrient paste. I could sense the echoes of grief in your neural chemistry." Vance felt a profound sense of violation, as if Aylin had been reading his private logs. "So all those meals were tailored for you," Aylin finished. "The broth in the first stew contained compounds from specific fungi that act as a powerful anti-inflammatory. The bread-like wafers were fortified with synthesized precursors for serotonin and dopamine to counteract the chemical melancholy of deep space travel. The meal I made for you tonight, before the Xylans came, it was designed to heighten your cognitive function and steady your nerves. I sensed you were anxious about our course." Vance was stunned into silence. It was all true. He had felt sharper, calmer. His leg hadn't ached in weeks. He had attributed it to a placebo effect, to the simple joy of a full belly. But it was science, an alien biological science he couldn't begin to comprehend. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Fear," Aylin said simply. "My ability is a resource to be exploited. To the Xylans, I was not a person. I was living in a living pharmaceutical factory. Warlord Valerius didn't want a happy chef. He wanted a tool that would grant him an edge. He pushed me to create formulations that would make his soldiers more aggressive, more resistant to pain. He wanted me to design a poison that would target a specific species' genetic code, one that could be delivered in a peace offering. I refused. That is why I fled. I would rather be a refugee scrubbing decks than a monster crafting plagues. A new, chilling layer of understanding settled over Vance. Aylin wasn't just a fugitive slave. He was a conscientious objector, a scientist who had refused to build a weapon of mass destruction. And Valerius didn't just want his property back. He wanted to silence a loose end and reacquire a strategic asset of immense value. You said Valerius fears what you could do to him, Vance recalled. What does that mean? The sensitivity works both ways, Captain, Aylin explained. Just as I can create a meal to heal or strengthen, I can also create one to disrupt. The Zealand physiology is powerful, but it is rigid. Their biochemistry is a fortress with very specific keys. I spent years studying Valerius. I know his body better than his own medics. I know the precise combination of proteins and enzymes that could bypass his immune system. I do not mean a poison that would kill him. That would be too simple. I mean something that could unmake him, overload his neural pathways, deconstruct his cellular structure, an elegant, biological cascade failure. Vance stared at the gentle giant, the quiet cook, and saw him for what he truly was. A man who held the power of life and death in his hands, not through a blaster, but through a saucepan. To prove his point, Aylin gestured for Vance to follow him to the tiny medical bay. It was little more than a closet with a diagnostic bed and an auto-dock. "Allow me," Aylin said. Vance, now convinced this was no elaborate trick, sat on the edge of the bed and rolled up his trouser leg, exposing the scarred, puckered flesh around his knee, where a piece of shrapnel had torn through it during a pirate attack years ago. It was a constant source of dull, throbbing pain, a barometer for bad weather and long G-burns. Aylin didn't touch it. He merely observed it, his dark eyes focused. He then went to the galley. He returned 20 minutes later with a small bowl containing a thick, warm poultice. It was a greenish-brown paste that smelled of herbs, soil, and something vaguely metallic. This is made from the ship's algae scrubber cultures, trace minerals from the water recycler, and a synthesized enzyme I created from the protein packs, Aylin explained. He gently applied the paste to the scarred area around Vance's knee. The effect was instantaneous and astonishing. A wave of soothing warmth spread through the joint, followed by a cool, tingling sensation. The deep, familiar ache that had been his companion for a decade simply vanished. Not masked, not numbed. It was gone. Vance flexed his knee. He stood up and put his full weight on it. There was no pain. None. He looked at Aylin, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "How?" "I am a cook, Captain," Aylin said, his voice holding no pride, only a deep, abiding sadness for the nature of his gift. "The body is simply the most complex kitchen I have ever worked in." Vance finally understood. They weren't just running from a possessive master. They were fugitives of a galactic power, harboring a man who represented a fundamental paradigm shift in biological warfare. They couldn't just run. They couldn't hide. Valerius would never stop hunting them. Sooner or later, they would be found. "All right, Aylin," Vance said, his voice grim. "From now on, we're not just hauling cargo. We're surviving. First things first, we need to get smarter. We need friends, and we need to disappear. I know a place, a scrapper and information broker in the Tartarus Rift. Name's Isabel Brown, but everyone calls her Izzy. She owes me a favor." She can get us a new transponder code. Maybe even some modifications for the vagrant. He looked at his cook, his friend. The balance of power on the ship had shifted. Vance was still the captain, but Aylin was their most powerful asset. "But you," Vance said, pointing a finger at the Cathar. "You are going to teach me everything you can about the Zelans, their biology, their weaknesses, everything you learned while serving Valerius. Because if they corner us, running won't be an option. And I have a feeling your cooking will be the only weapon that matters." The Tartarus Rift was a lawless stretch of space, a nebula of swirling dust and gravitational anomalies where pirates, smugglers, and fugitives went to disappear. It was a nightmare to navigate. But for Vance and Aylin, it was the perfect sanctuary. At its heart was a hollowed-out asteroid known only as the Anvil, home to Isabel "Izzy" Brown. Izzy was a legend in the Outer Rim, a master engineer and slicer who could coax a dead engine back to life or erase a ship's identity from every database in the sector for the right price. She was a small, wiry woman with grease-stained coveralls, cybernetic eyes that glowed a faint blue, and a wit as sharp as a plasma torch. She greeted Vance with a hearty punch to the shoulder. "Elias Vance, I figured you were dead or in a corporate prison by now," she cackled, her voice a gravelly rasp. "What's the trouble? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse, Izzy. We're being haunted by one," Vance said grimly. Over a mug of her notoriously strong, engine degreaser-like coffee, Vance explained the situation, leaving out the more fantastical details of Aylin's abilities, but making it clear they had drawn the personal attention of Warlord Valerius. Izzy's cybernetic eyes widened slightly. "Valerius? Elias? What in the blazes did you get into? You don't poke a Xylan hornet's nest. You nuke it from orbit and run. Wasn't my choice. I need the work, Izzy. A complete identity scrub for the vagrant. New transponder codes. Shell corporations for the registration. The whole package. And I need you to look at our sensors and drives. Anything you can do to make us quieter, faster, harder to spot." Izzy looked from Vance to the silent, hulking Cathar standing stoically in the corner of her workshop. "This is going to cost you more than that favor you're owed. This is high-risk, premium-grade work." "I'll pay," Vance said. "Whatever it takes." While Izzy and her team of repurposed industrial drones swarmed over the vagrant, turning it into a ghost ship, Aylin and Vance delved into their own work. The ship's galley became a laboratory. Aylin, using the ship's databases, began to compile everything he knew about Xylan physiology. "Their strength is also their weakness," Aylin explained one cycle, pointing to a complex holographic diagram of a Xylan cell. "They have an incredibly efficient metabolism and a redundant nervous system, which makes them resistant to conventional toxins and stun weaponry. But it all relies on a constant, precise intake of specific trace metals and amino acids. Disrupt that intake, or introduce a compound that mimics one of those metals, but bonds incorrectly with their enzymes, and their entire system grinds to a halt." Vance watched, fascinated, as Aylin worked. The Cathar would take a sample of the ship's water, analyze its mineral content, and then, using the hydroponics bay and nutrient synthesizer, create a tailored catalyst that would cause a specific fungus to produce a highly complex, targeted protein. It was like watching a master composer write a symphony, but instead of notes, his instruments were molecules. The days on the anvil turned into weeks. Izzy worked her magic. She replaced the ship's standard sensor suite with a military-grade passive sensor array that could drink in data without sending out a single ping. She rerouted the energy signature, baffling the engine output to mimic a dozen different common freighter models. The vagrant was no more. In the official records, she was now the Stardust Drifter, a nondescript hauler owned by a shell company based out of a defunct mining colony. Their escape from the anvil was just in time. One of Izzy's deep space listening posts picked up a surge in Xylan communications. A coded message, sliced and decrypted by Izzy, revealed Valerius had placed a massive bounty on their heads, specifically on a human captain and his Cathar companion. Every bounty hunter and scumbag from here to the galactic core would be looking for them. "The hunt is on, Elias," Izzy said, her blue eyes grim. "This new identity will buy you time, but Valerius is obsessive. He won't use conventional methods for long. He'll start looking for the patterns, for the anomalies. He'll find you." She was right. For the next few months, they lived on the knife's edge. They took short-haul cargo jobs in sparsely populated systems, always moving, never staying in one place for more than a single rotation. They jumped from nebulae to asteroid fields, from forgotten outposts to rogue planets. The constant threat wore on Vance, but it seemed to forge Aelin. With every passing day, the Cathar grew more confident. He began to speak more, offering tactical suggestions and navigational insights. His quiet presence became a source of strength for Vance, a calm anchor in a sea of chaos. The food, too, became a weapon in their flight. Aelin developed a series of dietary regimens for Vance. One combination of foods would heighten his senses and reflexes for a difficult asteroid field navigation. Another would allow him to go without sleep for 36 hours without suffering from cognitive decline during a long, desperate run. Vance was becoming more than human. His body and mind honed to a razor's edge by Aelin's biochemical artistry. Their first close call came in the Omicron Persei system. They were docked at a grimy refueling station when Vance noticed a Trandoshan bounty hunter, a species known for their tracking skills, eyeing their ship a little too closely. "Aelin," Vance said softly over their private comlink. "We've been made." While Vance created a distraction by accidentally spilling a crate of slippery machine parts in the docking bay, Aelin went to work in the galley. He quickly prepared a small, enticingly fragrant meat pie and left it on the galley's external service hatch, as if it were a discarded lunch. As the Trandoshan snuck closer to their ship, he saw the pie. Unable to resist a free meal, he devoured it. 10 minutes later, as the vagrant, now the Stardust Drifter, was pulling away from the station, the bounty hunter was overcome by a sudden and violently incapacitating digestive distress, a condition Aelin had specifically engineered for the unique quirks of the Trandoshan gastrointestinal system. It wouldn't kill him, but he wouldn't be tracking anyone for at least a week. They had escaped. But it was a sign. The net was closing. The final trap was sprung near the forsaken world of LV-117, a planet quarantined for a biological plague decades ago, and now a dead zone. A distress signal, faint and desperate, echoed through the void. A freighter, claiming its life support was failing. It was an old trick, the oldest in the book. Vance knew it was a trap, but as he scanned the signal, he saw the ship's designation. It was an old model, a Firefly-class freighter named the Serenity's Ghost. It was the same class of ship his first command had been, the ship on which his wife and daughter had served with him before they were killed in a botched raid that had led to his discharge. Valerius hadn't found them through sensors or trackers. He had dug into Vance's past. He had found his weakness. It wasn't a trap for a random freighter captain. It was a trap for Elias Vance. "He knows," Vance said, his voice cold. "He knows who I am." Aelin stood beside him, watching the blinking distress signal on the screen. "It is a lure, Captain. We must not take it." "I know," Vance said, his hands tightening on the controls. But he couldn't turn away. It was a desecration of his memory, a ghost summoned to torment him. His anger warred with his logic. And then 3 Xylan warships, including the Harbinger, dropped out of hyperspace, boxing them in. The trap wasn't the distress signal. The distress signal was just the bait to hold them in place. Commander Kyle's face appeared on the main screen, his reptilian features twisted in a triumphant sneer. "Run out of space to hide, Captain Vance. Warlord Valerius is tired of this game. He has come to collect his property personally. He invites you to surrender. He will grant you a swift death. Refuse, and he will enjoy dismantling your ship and your body, piece by piece." Through Kale's shoulder, Vance could see another figure on the Xylan bridge, seated in a command throne, tall, imposing, and radiating an aura of absolute power. Warlord Valerius. They were cornered, outgunned. There was no escape. Vance looked at Aelin. Cathar's face was calm, resolute. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold fire. "Captain," Aelin said, his deep voice resonating with a strange confidence. "Please, accept his invitation." Vance stared at him. "Accept? Aelin, that's suicide." "No," Aelin said, a strange, fierce light in his eyes. "It is a dinner party, and I have been planning the menu for a long time." The boarding was a formal, chilling affair. There was no violence, no bluster. The vagrant was caught in a tractor beam, its engines cold, its weapons useless. On the view screen, Warlord Valerius himself issued the final command. His voice was not the hissing rasp of Commander Kyle, but a smooth, cultured baritone that was somehow more menacing. "Captain Vance," Valerius began, his obsidian black eyes pinning Vance even through the screen. "You have been a surprising nuisance. I admire tenacity, but the game is over. Bring my property to your airlock. You will accompany him. We will dine together on my flagship. A final meal to celebrate the end of your pathetic rebellion." Vance's hand instinctively went to the blaster, hidden under his console, but he saw Aelin shake his head almost imperceptibly. "We will comply," Vance bit out, the words tasting like ash. He and Aelin walked side by side down the corridor to the airlock. "This is insane, Aelin," Vance whispered. "He'll kill us both." "He will not kill me until he is certain I will serve him again," Aelin replied, his voice calm. "And he will not kill you until after he has savored his victory. His ego demands an audience. That is our weapon." Aelin was carrying a single, sealed container. It was insulated, maintaining a precise temperature. Inside was the meal he had prepared. They were escorted across the void by a contingent of shock troopers to the bridge of the Harbinger. The Xylan warship was the antithesis of the vagrant, all sharp angles, gleaming black surfaces, and cold, crimson light. At the center of the bridge, on a raised dais, sat Warlord Valerius. In person, he was even more imposing. His scales were the color of a starless night sky, and his uniform was adorned with the medals of 100 conquered worlds. He radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. He dismissed the guards with a wave of his hand, leaving Vance, Aelin, and Commander Kale alone with him on the command deck. A small, polished table rose from the floor. "Unit 734, Valerius said, his voice smooth as silk. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble. I am most displeased, but your talents are too valuable to waste. You will be reconditioned. You will serve me again." He then turned his chilling gaze to Vance. "And you, Captain, you have proven to be a greater fool than I imagined, meddling in the affairs of your superiors. But before I have you spaced, you will watch as my property is returned to its rightful place." "He is not your property," Vance growled, his fists clenching. Valerius chuckled, a dry, humourless sound. "Everything is my property, human. I simply have yet to collect it all." He gestured to the container in Aylin's hands. "I understand you have prepared a meal, a token of your surrender, perhaps. Let us see if your skills have atrophied during your little adventure." Aylin stepped forward and placed the container on the table. With deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness, he opened it. The aroma that filled the bridge was intoxicating. It was complex and savory, with hints of roasted meats, earthy fungi, and a sweet, unidentifiable spice that seemed to sing in the air. He plated the meal. It was a work of art, a small, intricately arranged portion of what looked like a rich terrine, surrounded by vibrant, jewel-toned jellies and microgreens. Valerius looked at it, a flicker of appreciation in his cold eyes. "You always did have a flair for presentation." He picked up a fork. "Wait," Vance said, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. This was the moment. Valerius paused, an eyebrow ridge raised. "Yes? That food. It's for Xylans," Vance said, thinking fast. "I can't eat that. It would probably kill a human." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Valerius smirked. "Indeed, your crude biology would likely collapse. A pity." His attention returned to the plate, his arrogance overriding any hint of suspicion. He took a small bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing in gustatory pleasure. "Exquisite," he murmured. "The texture is perfect. The balance of flavors. Better than I remember." He took another, larger bite. And then he stopped. His eyes snapped open. They were wide with confusion, not pain. He looked down at the fork in his hand, as if he'd never seen it before. What is this?" he stammered, his smooth voice cracking. "It is called the Feast of Consequences, Warlord," Aylin said, his voice resonating with a power Vance had never heard before. Valerius's hand began to tremble. He dropped the fork, which clattered loudly on the deck. A strange, bluish tinge began to creep up from his neck, a sign of severe circulatory distress in Xylans. "Poison!" Commander Kyle snarled, raising his sidearm. "No," Aylin said calmly, standing his ground. "Poison is brutish. This is clarity." Valerius gasped, his body seizing, but he wasn't choking. He was staring into the distance, his eyes unfocused, brimming with a horror that was not physical. "The dish contains a retrosynthetic neuropeptide I designed," Aylin explained, his voice echoing on the silent bridge. "It is keyed to your specific DNA, Warlord. It does not attack your cells. It unlocks them. Specifically, it unlocks the dormant empathy centers in the Xylan brain, the very ones your people genetically suppressed generations ago to make you better conquerors." Valerius began to moan, a low, guttural sound of agony. He clutched his head, his claws scraping against his own scales. "What are you feeling, Warlord?" Aylin asked, his voice relentless. "Is it the terror of the Cathar children as your ships burned our world from orbit? Is it the agony of the colonists on Cygnus X-1 as your soldiers vented their habitats? I have fed you a catalyst. It is forcing your mind to perfectly process and experience every single death, every iota of pain and suffering you have ever inflicted upon the galaxy. All at once." Valerius screamed. It was not a roar of anger, but a raw, piercing shriek of pure mental agony. He collapsed from his throne, writhing on the deck, his mind drowning in an ocean of blood he himself had spilled. He was being assaulted by 1 billion ghosts, each one crying out from within his own consciousness. Commander Kyle stared, frozen in shock and disbelief, at his writhing, screaming leader. This was not a wound he could fight, not an enemy he could shoot. In that moment of hesitation, Vance acted. He lunged forward, slamming his elbow into Kael's temple. The Xylan commander, disoriented, stumbled back. Vance grabbed the Xylan's sidearm from his hand and slammed the butt of the weapon against the bridge's main environmental control panel, shattering the screen in a shower of sparks. Red alert klaxons blared. The bridge doors slammed shut. Emergency atmosphere shields flickered to life. Valerius was now catatonic, curled in a fetal position, tears streaming from his yellow eyes, as his mind was endlessly, eternally torn apart by the weight of his own atrocities. His reign of terror was over, ended not by a fleet of warships, but by a single, perfectly crafted bite of food. Vance stood over the broken warlord, the Xylan blaster heavy in his hand. He looked at Aelin, whose face was grim but resolute. "Let's go home," Vance said. The chaos on the bridge of the Harbinger was their cover. With Warlord Valerius mentally shattered and the command systems in disarray, Vance and Aelin fought their way back to the airlock. The shock troopers, without clear orders, were a disorganized mob. They were soldiers trained for conquest, not for containing a psychological implosion at the heart of their command structure. They made it back to the Vagrant, or Stardust Drifter as she was now known, sealed the airlock, and Vance gunned the engines. The tractor beam, its power fluctuating without a steady hand at the controls, sputtered and died. Vance didn't hesitate. He firewalled the throttle, pushing the freighter's modified engines to their absolute limit. They tore away from the crippled Xylan flagship, jumping to hyperspace just as a few disorganized shots lanced through the space where they had been. They didn't stop for 3 days. They pushed the ship through a series of random, pre-calculated jumps, a frantic, desperate flight into the deep, unmapped black. Finally, in the quiet solitude of an unnamed system with a single, dying red dwarf star, Vance let the engines cool. Silence descended, broken only by the ship's quiet hum. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Vance sat in the captain's chair, staring at the crimson star, his knuckles white on the controls. Aelin stood behind him, a silent, slate-grey mountain. "You know," Vance finally said, his voice hoarse, "for 20 years, I've imagined getting revenge on the people who destroyed my life. I imagined fire and explosions, grand speeches, a blaze of glory." He shook his head slowly. "I never once imagined winning a war with a recipe." He turned to look at Aelin. The Cathar's dark eyes were filled with a profound weariness, but also a sliver of peace. "It was not about revenge, Captain," Aelin said softly. "It was about justice. Valerius was not defeated. He was made to understand. He's alive? His body lives," Aelin confirmed. "But his mind, his consciousness, is now a permanent prison built from the pain of his victims. He will harm no one ever again. And the Dominion, a body with its head severed, will thrash for a time. But it will fall. There will be chaos, power struggles. It will be years, decades even, before they can threaten the galaxy again. We did not just save ourselves, Captain. We may have saved many." Vance leaned back, the truth of Aelin's words washing over him. They had done the impossible. 2 beings in a beat-up freighter had decapitated an interstellar empire. It was the ultimate HFY story. Humanity F. Yeah, except the hero wasn't a soldier with a big gun. He was a quiet cook who believed in empathy as a fundamental cosmic force. "What now, Aelin?" Vance asked. The question hung in the air. They were still fugitives. The Xylan Dominion, even in disarray, would want answers. The bounty on their heads might even increase. Aelin walked over to the galley entryway, then turned back to face Vance. A small, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time since Vance had met him. It transformed his severe, alien features into something warm and gentle. "Now, Captain," Alan said, his deep voice filled with a newfound lightness, "I believe it is my turn to cook. You look like a man who has earned a victory meal." Vance watched him go. He looked out at the vast, star-dusted canvas of the universe. For the first time in decades, it didn't look empty and hostile. It looked full of possibilities. They weren't hauling cargo anymore. They weren't running. They had a new purpose. They were a two-man crew on a ghost ship, armed with a conscience, a lifetime of experience, and the most powerful, most unusual weapon in the galaxy, a Cathar chef. A delicious aroma, one of hope and new beginnings, began to drift from the galley. Elias Vance leaned back in his chair, and, for the first time in a very long time, he laughed. Their course was unknown, their future uncertain, but for now, they were free, and they were home. And so, the tale of Captain Vance and his quiet cook, Alan, doesn't truly end. It just sets a new course. Their story reminds us that strength isn't always found in the barrel of a gun, and that the greatest weapon against tyranny can be empathy, understanding, and, in this case, a well-timed meal. It's a testament to the idea that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, in the quiet corners of a space station, in the galley of a rusty freighter, in a heart that refuses to become a monster. What did you think of Alan's unique form of justice? Was it a more fitting end for a warlord than simple destruction? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this journey aboard the Vagrant, please consider giving this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more science fiction stories like this one, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss where we travel next. Thank you for listening.